There's this moment I keep replaying in my head. I'm standing in the kitchen, holding a wooden spoon with marinara dripping off the edge, and Marlene walks in wearing that old navy blue hoodie she always stole from me. She's laughing, really laughing, that kind of open-mouth, careless laugh that made me fall for her in the first place. I thought everything was fine. I remember thinking, she still looks at me like I'm her favorite person. I was so wrong. I think the worst part is, there wasn't a single defining moment. No slamming doors, no screaming fights. Just a party game. Something harmless. Something stupid. A joke, she said. You'll laugh about it tomorrow, she told me. But I didn't laugh. I still haven't. Let me back up. My name's Lowell. I'm 38, and I work at a small-town library, the kind that still smells like old books and has a reading nook by the window. I'm not exciting. I know that. I've always leaned into being the quiet guy, the listener, the guy who brings homemade soup to sick friends and checks on his elderly neighbors. I thought being kind was enough. I thought love meant comfort and patience and staying when things felt dull. Marlene, she used to say she loved those things about me. We'd been drifting lately. I could feel it, even if she kept insisting nothing had changed. The way she checked her phone more often. The way her laugh felt forced when I made dumb puns like I always did. I noticed, but I didn't want to make it real by bringing it up. So when she invited me to that little couples game night her friend hosted, I agreed without thinking. Maybe I thought it'd bring us closer. Maybe I just didn't want to be left out. 8 people. For couples. A cozy house with candles flickering and jazz playing in the background. Everyone was sipping wine out of mismatched glasses, and laughter echoed off the kitchen tiles. It was warm, comfortable, or it should have been. Then came the cards. Some game one of her friends brought. Truth or Dare, Couples Edition. Supposed to be funny, lighthearted. Not the kind of thing I'd normally enjoy, but I wanted to be part of her world. So I smiled, said, why not, and tried to go with it. And then she pulled that card. The one that said, pretend to flirt with someone in the group, just for fun. Make it convincing. Everyone hooted and laughed. Marlene glanced at me, grinned, then turned to Connor. Not me. Connor. She stood up, ran her fingers through her hair like she used to do for me, and sat in his lap. Right in his lap. The whole room erupted in laughter. People shouted, whoa. Okay, okay, while she leaned close to his ear and whispered something. His face turned red. Hers didn't. And me? I just sat there, holding a wine glass I hadn't even sipped from, smiling too wide, pretending it was funny, pretending I didn't feel something sink to the pit of my stomach and settle there like a stone. When it was over, she came back to me, kissed my cheek, and said, don't be so uptight, babe. It's just a joke. But something inside me cracked. Something I didn't even know could break. Because when she kissed me, it didn't feel like comfort. It felt like cover-up. And that night was only the beginning. I didn't sleep that night. Marlene did, of course. She always could. I watched her back rise and fall under the blanket like nothing happened. Like she hadn't straddled another man's lap 2 feet away from me while her friends laughed and clapped like we were in some twisted improv show. Her phone buzzed once around 1:40 a.m., screen lighting up the room just long enough for me to see Connor's name. She didn't hear it. I just lay there, still as a statue, pretending to be asleep, pretending not to notice that the buzz didn't wake her because she wasn't waiting for my messages anymore. I kept going over the moment again and again in my head, but it was never just the moment that haunted me. It was the way she looked when she did it. Comfortable. Almost relieved. That's what I can't unsee. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't something spontaneous that got away from her. She chose him. She chose the joke. She chose the laugh. The next morning, she poured coffee like always. Casually. Like everything was fine. She even hummed. I swear to God, she was humming. She slid the mug toward me across the counter and smiled like nothing inside me had cracked open 12 hours ago. I could barely make eye contact with her. My hands were shaking just holding the cup, and she didn't even notice. So, she said, like it was nothing. Everyone had a blast last night. We should do more nights like that. More nights like that? I didn't know what to say. I mumbled something, maybe sure or uh-huh, but my voice barely came out. She kissed the top of my head and left for work, and I sat at the table for almost 2 hours after she was gone. Just sitting, thinking, wondering if I was losing my mind, or if this was the slow-motion collapse of something I'd been too blind to see unraveling. That weekend, I tried to bring it up. I told her that the joke felt off to me, that it stung a little. I thought if I was honest, she'd be too. Maybe we'd talk about boundaries. Maybe she'd apologize or at least see where I was coming from. But she didn't. Instead, she rolled her eyes and told me I was being emotional. She said, "Lowell, it was just a dumb party game. You need to stop being so sensitive all the time. It's exhausting." Exhausting. That word gutted me. I didn't cry right then, but I felt the lump in my throat pushing up like it wanted to. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood. I didn't want to fight. I never do. That's the thing about me. I'm the kind of man who tries to de-escalate. I'd rather suffer in silence than raise my voice. I always thought that was strength. But that day, it just made me feel small. After that conversation, something shifted. Subtle at first. Her phone was always face down. She started going out more. Not late nights or anything obvious, just little things. Brunch with coworkers, yoga after work, a quick coffee run. I never questioned her. I didn't want to seem jealous or paranoid. But inside, I felt like I was slowly drowning in a sea of quiet doubts and awkward smiles. One night about a week later, I came home earlier than usual. Her car was in the driveway, lights on in the living room. I felt a weird knot in my stomach, one of those good feelings you can't explain. I walked in and heard her laughing, low, breathy laughter. Not her normal laugh. A different one. The kind of laugh I hadn't heard since our honeymoon. I stepped into the living room, and she was there, on the couch, sitting just a little too close to someone on her laptop screen. It was Connor. A video call. His shirt was off. Hers wasn't, but it felt just as intimate. She scrambled to pause the call when she saw me, like a teenager getting caught sneaking out. She stuttered something about work, some team-building thing. I didn't say anything. I didn't accuse. I just nodded, walked to the kitchen, and opened the fridge even though I wasn't hungry. I stared into it like it held answers. She didn't say sorry. She didn't even explain. She just acted like I was overreacting again, like my very presence was an inconvenience. That night, I didn't sleep either. I lay awake again, but this time, I wasn't confused. I was empty. And for the first time in our marriage, I felt alone in the same bed I once felt safest in. And still, I stayed. I kept hoping it was just a phase, that things would go back to how they were. That maybe, somehow, I was imagining things. Because I loved her. And I thought love meant holding on, even when it hurt. But I didn't realize then that I wasn't holding on to her. I was holding on to the memory of who she used to be. And she wasn't that person anymore. There's a strange thing that happens when your heart starts to break in silence. It doesn't shatter like glass. It wears down like stone, slowly, invisibly, painfully. It's not a scream or a sudden betrayal. It's more like 100 quiet moments that build up until one day you wake up and realize you've been grieving someone who's still living in your house. That was where I found myself, sitting in my car in our driveway, staring at the front porch light flickering, knowing Marlene was inside, and not feeling like I belonged anymore. It was a Tuesday. I remember because I'd brought home her favorite almond Danish from that bakery 2 towns over. I used to do things like that a lot. Not for praise, not because she asked, just because I loved her. I liked doing small things. I believed love was in the details. But lately, the details didn't seem to matter anymore. I could have walked in with roses, a handwritten poem, and a signed letter from her favorite author, and I think she still would have said, "Thanks," without looking up from her phone. But that day, I didn't even make it inside. I was getting out of the car when I heard her laugh through the open upstairs window. Not the usual tired chuckle I'd been hearing around me lately, the polite one she gave when I made one of my corny jokes. No, this one was real. Full-throated, joyful, light. I hadn't heard that kind of laugh from her in months. Not toward me, not even near me. I froze. Something about that sound felt like a confession, and I hated myself for loving how beautiful it still was. Then came the voice. His voice. Connor. Again. He was on speaker. I don't know what he said, but she responded with, "Stop it, you're awful," in a tone I used to think belonged to me. She giggled again, and then the sound of something knocking, maybe her elbow hitting her nightstand, maybe the phone slipping. I shouldn't have stood there listening. I know that. But I couldn't move. I felt like a kid pressing his ear to the door of a room he's not allowed in, trying to confirm the worst without actually seeing it. Eventually, I walked inside, climbed the stairs slowly, each creak of the woodboard underneath me dragging shame and fear up my spine. I paused outside our bedroom door. It was mostly closed, just cracked. I could see a sliver of her reflection in the mirror. She was sitting on the bed, legs crossed, phone in hand, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in a year. She didn't hear me. I stood there for what felt like 5 full minutes, watching the woman I married become a stranger I couldn't reach. And I didn't interrupt her. I just turned around and went back down the stairs, Danish still in hand, and sat in the kitchen in the dark. I couldn't eat. I couldn't cry. I just sat there, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floor above me. Later that night, she came down, phone in hand, and told me she was meeting her sister for dinner the next night. "Just us girls," she said. "You don't mind, right?" I shook my head. I didn't trust my voice. She kissed me on the cheek, too fast, too light, and went to bed without waiting for me. I waited until she fell asleep. Then I got up, walked into the bathroom, and sat on the edge of the tub with the lights off. I don't know how long I stayed there. An hour, maybe 2. Long enough for the tile floor to turn cold against my feet. I remember staring at our toothbrushes, hers blue, mine green, and thinking about how close they stood next to each other in that little ceramic cup. Closer than we'd been in weeks. The next morning, she left early. I didn't even hear her car pull out. But I found a note by the coffee maker that read, "Gone to yoga, back late. Don't wait up." No heart, no smiley face, not even a love you. Just cold ink on paper. So I didn't wait up. But I didn't sleep either. And somewhere deep inside me, I think I finally admitted something I hadn't wanted to believe until then, that maybe this wasn't a rough patch. Maybe it wasn't a phase. Maybe the woman upstairs had already emotionally checked out, and I was the only one still flipping through the pages of a love story she'd stopped reading long ago. I started noticing the distance in ways I'd never prepared for, not in arguments or slammed doors, but in the quietest corners of our shared life. The toothbrushes still stood side by side, but her scent no longer lingered in our bed the way it used to. The mugs in the cupboard still sat as a pair, but she stopped handing me mine in the morning. Her slippers still rested by the foot of the couch, but I realized I hadn't seen her actually wear them in weeks. It was like she was there, but she wasn't. Her physical presence remained, but her spirit, her warmth, her energy had slipped through my fingers before I even noticed I was gripping too loosely. We still spoke, technically, but our words had become a string of logistical exchanges. "Did you get the mail? I think we're out of oat milk. Don't forget my mom's dinner on Saturday." There was nothing left that held weight. No more long talks at night about dreams or fears or future trips we'd never take. I'd lie beside her and listen to her breathing, steady and unaware, and I'd wonder if she even knew I was still awake beside her, if she even cared. Some nights I'd whisper, "I love you," into the dark just to see if she'd respond, even in sleep. She never did. One morning, she left her phone on the kitchen table while she showered. I don't know what came over me. I hadn't snooped before. I'd always believed that trust meant privacy. But this wasn't about trust anymore. It was about the aching suspicion that I was the only one still pretending we were okay. I told myself I wouldn't open anything. I just needed to know. Just a glance. Just a confirmation that I was wrong, that I was being paranoid again. That maybe I was just sensitive, like she always said. The screen lit up with a message from Connor. Just his name. Nothing else. My chest tightened. My hand hovered above the screen. But I didn't open it. I couldn't. Instead, I locked the screen, stepped back, and stared at the table like it had personally betrayed me. I felt ashamed. Not for what I'd done, but for what I wanted to do. For needing proof that my own wife might be slipping into someone else's arms emotionally, or worse, had already fallen, and just hadn't bothered to tell me. That night, we went to her mother's birthday dinner. I remember standing in her parents' foyer, watching Marlene laugh with her sister while holding a wine glass, perfectly polished and radiant. She looked free, lighter than she had with me in months. I caught her eye once across the room. She smiled politely. Not the kind of smile that said, "There's my husband." More like, "There's someone I used to know." And I stood there holding a wrapped gift I picked out myself, feeling like an extra in a scene where I used to be the lead. On the way home, I tried to talk to her. I asked if she was happy. Not in an accusatory way, just gently. I told her I missed her, that I missed us. She stayed quiet for a long time. The hum of the tires on the road was the only sound between us. Finally, she said, "I think we've just gotten too comfortable. You know." Then she rolled down the window, let the cold night air rush in, and leaned her head back like she was somewhere far away. Too comfortable. As if all the love I had poured into stability, consistency, loyalty, the very foundation of what I thought marriage was, had become boring. Predictable. As if the safety I tried so hard to build became the cage she needed to escape. When we got home, she went straight to bed without another word. I stayed downstairs. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't scroll through my phone. I just sat on the edge of the couch in the dark, letting silence crawl over me like a second skin. I thought about how we used to fall asleep with our feet tangled together. How she used to text me at work just to say she missed me. How she once cried when I was sick because she hated seeing me in pain. And now she barely looked at me when she walked through the room. People think heartbreak happens in a single moment, a betrayal, a scream, a discovery. But sometimes, it's this slow erosion. The death of 1,000 kind gestures that used to mean something. And I was mourning something no one could see. I was grieving a ghost that still walked, still breathed, still smiled across rooms filled with people who didn't know we were coming apart in silence. That was the night I realized I wasn't just losing her. I was losing the version of myself that believed love alone could keep someone from leaving. It's strange how a person can vanish without ever leaving. Marlene was still in the house, her shoes still by the door, her scent still on the pillow, but the part of her that made her Marlene to me had drifted so far away, it felt like I needed binoculars just to remember who she used to be. We still moved through the same rooms, passed each other in the hallway, sat across from each other at the dinner table. But we were shadows now, outlines of people who once loved each other, so deeply we used to finish each other's thoughts. Now we were just filling space and pretending not to notice how far we'd fallen. I'd taken to talking to myself. Not out loud, at first. Just in my head. Little things. Reassurances. Questions. The kinds of words I used to share with her, now whispered internally in circles that never ended. Is this normal? Am I losing her? Did I imagine how good it used to be? Was I ever enough to begin with? Eventually, the whispers turned into mutters. I'd find myself walking around the house mumbling things like, maybe she's just tired, or it's probably work stress, like I was trying to defend her to the jury in my mind. One night, I caught myself apologizing to the sink. I had dropped a glass while washing dishes, and out of habit said, "I'm sorry." Then I realized no one was around. Marlene was out again. Something about a work dinner, though she hadn't mentioned one before. I stood there barefoot, wet-handed, staring at the broken shards on the floor, and I started to cry. Not the loud, heaving kind of cry. Just slow tears. The kind that fall without permission, not from a moment of sadness, but from 1,000 small ones that you never properly dealt with. The next morning, she texted me from upstairs. "Can you pick up dog food? Forgot yesterday." That was it. No greeting. No, good morning. Not even a thank you when I texted back, sure. That was when I started thinking about silence as a language. It's not the absence of communication, it is communication. And she was speaking volumes. I decided to try something different that night. I made dinner, nothing fancy, just baked chicken and roasted potatoes, her favorite. I lit a candle. I even changed out of my usual gray hoodie and put on a button-up I hadn't worn in months. I wanted to make an effort. I wanted her to see that I still cared, even if she didn't. I just needed to feel like I was doing something. She came home late. I heard the garage door creak open at 8:47 p.m. I had already reheated the food twice. When she walked in, she looked surprised. Not happy. Not upset. Just caught off guard, like she forgot we even shared a kitchen. "What's all this?" she asked, dropping her keys in the bowl like she always did. "I made dinner," I said. "Thought we could eat together." She gave a tight smile. "I already grabbed something on the way home." "Sorry." And then, like it was nothing, she walked past me, poured herself a glass of wine, and headed to the bedroom. I stood there, watching the candle flicker, feeling stupid for having tried. That was when I started talking out loud again. Not to her. Not to anyone. Just to the room. "I don't know how to fix this," I said to no one. Later, I packed the leftovers into containers and washed the dishes without saying another word. She never came back out. I heard the soft glow of her TV show playing behind the door. Laughter, canned, scripted, echoed from the speakers. And I sat on the couch alone, with my phone in my hand, debating whether I should call someone. But who? My friends didn't know what was going on. I'd never told them. I didn't want to seem like the weak one, like the guy who couldn't hold his marriage together. But I was weak. I knew it. I could feel the weakness sitting in my bones like old rainwater, seeping deeper with every quiet dinner and unanswered message. The kind of weakness that doesn't come from lack of strength, but from too much waiting, too much hoping. I started writing that night. Not for her. Not even for me. Just for the sake of putting the weight somewhere else. I opened a blank document and typed. She was sitting 2 feet away, but I've never felt farther from her. That was all I managed before I closed the laptop. I didn't have the energy to keep writing. I didn't even know if there was a point. But that line haunted me. 2 feet away. a whole world apart. You ever find yourself touching a photo just to feel something familiar? Like your fingers brushing over someone's frozen smile might somehow bring them back? I did that last week. I was organizing the old photo albums we used to keep on the bottom bookshelf in the living room, the ones neither of us had opened since before the pandemic. It started innocently enough. I was dusting, moving things around. But then my hand slipped, and the album fell open on its own, landing on a photo of us at Lake Marin. That weird weekend getaway where it rained the whole time, and we played card games in the cabin like we were kids. She was holding a mug of hot chocolate, staring right at me while I took the picture. Her cheeks were pink from the cold. Her smile was real. I remember that day like it was yesterday. She laughed when I dropped the deck of cards and claimed I was just trying to distract her because I was losing. I stared at that photo for a long time. I didn't cry. I thought I would. But I didn't. I just sat there, running my fingers along the glossy edge of a life that didn't exist anymore. It felt like I was grieving someone who hadn't died, someone who was still upstairs scrolling on her phone, unaware that I was downstairs holding a photograph like it was a lifeline. I kept flipping through the album, each page a reminder of what we used to be. Her head on my shoulder during that concert we couldn't afford. That blurry selfie on the ferry where her hair was all over the place. A picture of our old apartment with moving boxes behind us and a pizza box on the floor because we didn't own a table yet. We were broke, tired, and happy. But then the photos stopped. The last page was from 4 years ago. After that, nothing. Just blank space. A silent admission that somewhere along the way, we stopped recording us. That same night, I tried something I hadn't done in months. I reached for her hand in bed. It was late. She'd just turned off the light. I waited until the silence had settled, and then, slowly, reached across the sheets, hoping to brush against her fingers, hoping she might take it. That maybe we'd lie there quietly, hand in hand, even if nothing else made sense. She flinched. Not a big movement, not dramatic, but enough. She pulled her hand away without a word, shifted slightly, and turned her back to me. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just lay there with my arms suspended in the air for a moment too long, then slowly brought it back and rested it on my chest like a folded flag. I didn't try again after that. The next day, I found an old notebook tucked in the back of her desk drawer while I was searching for a stamp. I shouldn't have opened it, I know, but I was looking for anything. A clue, a hint, something to confirm what I already knew but couldn't say out loud. And on the second page, in her familiar loopy handwriting, was a list. Things that make me feel alive. I read it. Waking up before sunrise. Spontaneous road trips. Connor making me laugh when no one else can. New books. Getting out of town for a while. My name wasn't on the list. I stood there holding the notebook like it was burning my hands. I didn't feel anger. Not really. Just a dull, cold sort of ache, like walking outside without a coat in early spring and pretending it's warm enough. It wasn't even what she wrote about him. It was the fact that she needed a list at all, that she had to write down what made her feel alive because she hadn't felt it in so long. That night, I cooked again. I don't even know why. Habit, maybe. Some old part of me still operating on autopilot, still believing that food could fix what words couldn't. She came home late again, later than usual. Her makeup was different. Her blouse wasn't something I'd seen before. I told myself not to read into it. Maybe she went shopping. Maybe it was for a work presentation. Maybe. She didn't say much. Just kissed me on the cheek, said, "Smells nice," and headed upstairs. I stood in the kitchen with the chicken growing cold on the plate, and the quiet in the room settled around me like fog. I couldn't eat. I just sat there, scrolling through old photos on my phone until I couldn't see anymore because my vision had blurred. I still hadn't said anything. No confrontations. No accusations. I wasn't even sure what I'd accuse her of. Emotional distance? Conversations with someone who clearly made her laugh in ways I no longer could? A slow fade out she never formally declared? I couldn't even tell if I was the one being left or the one refusing to leave. It was around 1 a.m. when I wandered back upstairs. She was asleep. Her face looked peaceful, soft. She always looked younger when she slept. I used to watch her like that and feel lucky. Now I looked at her and felt like a stranger in someone else's home. I whispered, "Good night," knowing she wouldn't hear it. Maybe that's why I said it at all. You don't realize how loud silence can be until it's the only thing left between two people. It's not like in the movies, where an argument clears the air or a sudden confession sends everything spiraling. Real life, for me at least, was made of long pauses, missed glances, doors that used to be open, now closed just far enough to send a message. I had started to notice the sound of Marlene typing from the other room more than the sound of her voice. Our marriage had become a whisper, and I was the only one still trying to listen. I had stopped asking where she was going at night. There was no point. The answers were always vague and short, just out, or, it's a girl's thing. Sometimes she'd toss in a laugh, like I was supposed to already know. Like the question itself was somehow childish. I stopped asking not because I stopped caring, but because I couldn't take the way her voice changed when she answered, cold, polite, transactional. The way someone talks to a store clerk, not a husband. What I hadn't stopped doing, though, was hoping. And I hated myself for that. I hated how even now, after everything, a tiny part of me still believed she'd walk through the door one night and say, "I've missed you." That she'd fall into my arms like she used to. That she'd apologize for drifting and tell me it was all just confusion. I still looked at the door sometimes when I heard her car pull in, like maybe this would be the night things changed. That she'd bring home something small, like a coffee or a movie we used to love, and look at me the way she did when we were new. But that night didn't come. Instead, something else did. It was a Thursday evening, and I had just gotten home from the library. I'd stayed late, not because of work, but because being home had started to feel like standing in the middle of a memory I wasn't allowed to touch. I liked the library after hours. The silence there didn't hurt. It was clean, peaceful. The kind of silence that holds you, not the kind that makes you feel invisible. I used to bring Marlene there sometimes, early in our relationship. She liked the old poetry books, the ones with yellowed pages and faded spines. I found myself reshelving a volume of Edna St. Vincent Millay and thought of her lips moving as she read it aloud years ago. I stood there longer than I needed to, holding the book like it was the last piece of her I understood. When I finally walked in the door that evening, the house was lit, but quiet. Her car was in the driveway. Her shoes were by the door. I thought maybe, just maybe, she was waiting for me. I even smiled a little, like a fool. But as I rounded the corner into the living room, I froze. She wasn't alone. Connor's voice, his actual voice, not through a speaker, drifted out from the kitchen. I didn't hear laughter, or flirting, or anything dramatic. Just quiet conversation. Calm. Comfortable. Familiar. She hadn't told me he was coming over. She hadn't told me anything. And I didn't burst in. I didn't cause a scene. I didn't shout or demand answers. I just stood there, behind the wall, listening to them talk about a podcast, then some restaurant he recommended. They sounded like two people who shared something I no longer had access to. Something that used to be mine. I backed away slowly and went upstairs, heart pounding, hands shaking. Not because I'd caught them doing anything, but because they weren't even hiding it anymore. I wasn't being lied to, I was being erased, quietly and without ceremony. A few minutes later, I heard the front door open and close. His voice faded. Her footsteps came up the stairs. She walked past our bedroom, our shared bedroom, and into the guest room. She didn't say a word, not even good night. I didn't move. I didn't ask. I didn't cry. Instead, I laid there and imagined a version of myself that might have had the strength to leave. Not out of anger, but out of survival. But the truth is, I wasn't that man. Not yet. I was still clinging to the hope that maybe I was wrong. That maybe this was still salvageable. That somehow, the broken pieces could be fit back together. I know how pathetic that sounds. But love doesn't vanish just because someone else's feelings do. That's the cruel part. The person who stays, who still loves, who still remembers, they carry all the weight. They keep hoping in silence, writing invisible letters to a person who no longer reads them. I didn't sleep that night. I just stared at the ceiling, wondering when it became so easy for her to pretend I wasn't even there. It didn't happen all at once. There was no final argument. No grand reveal. No suitcase in the hallway or screaming match in the driveway. If anything, the ending came so quietly that, for a while, I didn't even notice it was already over. That was the strangest part, realizing our marriage hadn't ended in a crash, but in a whisper. A series of empty rooms, half-finished conversations, and morning coffee that no longer came with a smile. I remember the exact moment I knew I had to let go. It was 2 weeks after I heard Connor's voice in the kitchen. Marlene had taken to sleeping in the guest room full-time by then. She told me it was just temporary because she was sleeping better without all the tossing. But we both knew what it meant. One morning, I walked past the guest room and saw her suitcase half-packed, sitting on the bed. She wasn't leaving that day, but something in her already had. Later that night, we passed each other in the hallway. She was wearing a soft gray sweater I used to love on her, and I felt that old ache swell in my chest, the one that whispered, "You still love her." Even now. But when I looked into her eyes, I saw something I hadn't expected. Not anger. Not resentment. Just distance. And it was in that moment I realized I didn't want her to stay out of obligation. I didn't want to be pitted or tolerated. I didn't want a roommate who used to love me. I wanted peace. For both of us. Even if it meant letting go. I waited a few days before bringing it up. Not because I was afraid. I think I'd already mourned most of what we had. But I wanted to be sure I could speak calmly. Gently. Respectfully. And when I finally did, it was over a cup of tea in the living room. The same space where we used to fall asleep watching movies. I told her I thought maybe we'd both been trying to hold on to something that wasn't there anymore. That love wasn't just about staying. It was about presence, connection, effort. And I could feel we both drifted so far, we couldn't even see each other clearly anymore. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She just looked down at her mug and nodded slowly. "I think you're right," she said. And that was it. We didn't fight. We didn't blame. We just acknowledged the truth. The following weeks were surprisingly calm. We made arrangements. Divided things. She found a small apartment downtown near her sister. I kept the house. The silence between us softened. It wasn't cold anymore, just quiet. Like the final pages of a book we both finished reading a long time ago. The day she moved out, I helped her load the last few boxes into her car. We stood by the trunk for a while, neither of us knowing what to say. Then she turned to me, eyes damp but steady, and said, "You were always good to me. I just forgot how to be good back." I didn't answer right away, but I smiled genuinely for the first time in a long time and said, "I hope you find what makes you feel alive." She nodded, hugged me gently, and drove away. And for the first time in months, I didn't fall apart. In the days that followed, the silence in the house felt different. Not heavy, not haunting, just still. I started opening the windows more, playing old records, cooking for myself without the pressure of pleasing someone else. I went back to the library, not just for work, but to sit among the shelves and breathe in the comfort of familiarity. I even started writing again, not about heartbreak, but about beginnings. Because here's what I've learned. Sometimes, the kindest thing you can do for yourself is to stop waiting to be loved the way you used to be. Sometimes, you have to love yourself enough to accept the ending and still believe in something after it. A new chapter. A new quiet. One that isn't filled with confusion or waiting or second-guessing. I don't know what's next for me. Maybe someone new. Maybe just me for a while. But what I do know is that I'm not walking through the house hoping she'll come back anymore. I'm walking through it learning how to come back to myself. And that, I think, is the most peaceful ending I could ask for.